The story begins with the splintering crash of the smokehouse door. The overseer, Finch, a man built of gristle and grim duty, burst in, his face a mask of fury, expecting to drag a defiant woman back to her punishment. The camera pans past him into the small, dark interior. Instead of a captured runaway, there is an eerie stillness. The air was cold, thick with the smell of dead embers and something else, something wild and earthy like ozone after a lightning strike. The fire pit in the center was filled with gray, cold ash. The only sign of life was a perfect spiral of footprints in the dirt floor, circling the ashes, growing fainter with each rotation until they simply stopped, ending at a patch of unnaturally black, scorched earth. The overseer stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The door had been barred from the inside, yet the woman was gone. It was impossible, a trick of the light, a devil's bargain. He didn't know that this moment was not an ending, but a beginning. He didn't know that the story of Ruth Ellis was about to become a legend whispered in the dark, a spark of hope in the heart of bondage, a mystery that would echo for generations. But as the morning sun cast a long shadow through the broken doorway, one question hung in the air, colder than the ashes on the floor. How can a person simply vanish from a locked room? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The day before the vanishing was a crucible, forged in the oppressive heat and humidity of a Virginia summer on the Wallace plantation. The air was a wet, heavy blanket you couldn't throw off, thick with the drone of cicadas and the sweet, cloying scent of magnolia blossoms mingling with the sour smell of sweat and labor. The sun beat down with a personal malevolence, bleaching the sky to a pale, hazy blue and turning the red clay paths into shimmering ribbons of heat. This was the world of Ruth Ellis, but she moved through it as if she belonged to another. She was not a mere field hand, though her palms were cross-hatched with the hard calluses of a life spent toiling under that same merciless sun. There was a quiet, piercing intelligence in her dark eyes, a deliberate grace in her movements that belied her station as property. While others sagged under the weight of the heat, their motions slow and weary, Ruth's were economical and precise, her posture retaining a dignity that the world around her was designed to strip away. We see her in the sliver of shade behind the row of slave cabins, a space that offered a brief respite from the overseer's gaze. Her younger brother Jacob, a boy of about 10 with wide, curious eyes and a perpetually smudged face, sat before her. He was her shadow, her charge, the one piece of her heart that lived outside her own body. In her hand, she held a discarded piece of charcoal, its edges sharp. In the packed dirt, she carefully drew a letter, a perfect, clean, "Ah, this one sounds like the start of a sigh," she whispered, her voice a low, gentle murmur that was lost in the ever-present hum of the plantation. "And this," she drew a bee, "is like the buzz of the bee that wants the flower." Jacob watched, his brow furrowed in concentration, his small finger tracing the shapes in the air. This was their most dangerous secret, a stolen education in a place where knowledge for a slave was a brand of rebellion punishable by the lash. Her hands, which could pick cotton until they bled, could also form the delicate architecture of letters, building a world for Jacob that existed beyond the confines of their bondage. Her eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing, from the slightest change in the overseer's mood to the way a storm cloud gathered on the horizon. The source of Ruth's immediate dread, a cold knot that tightened in her stomach whenever he was near, was introduced in the form of Elias Wallace, the plantation owner's son. He was a man whose cruelty was matched only by his entitlement, his face perpetually flushed with drink and arrogance. He cornered Ruth near the well as she drew water for the evening meal. The air around him smelled of whiskey and stale tobacco. "You've been avoiding me, Ruth," he said, his voice a low drawl that was meant to be charming but was only menacing. He stepped closer, invading her space, his eyes crawling over her with a possessive hunger. "A pretty thing like you shouldn't be so shy." His hand reached out, intending to stroke her arm, but she pulled away with a swift, sharp movement. It was not a gesture of fear, but of cold, profound rejection. A flicker of fury crossed Elias's face, his lips thinning into a sneer. The quiet dignity she carried like a shield infuriated him because it was something he could not own, could not break. "You belong to my father," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "That means you belong to me. I'll have you, one way or another. Don't you forget it." He turned and stalked away, leaving his threat to hang in the humid air like a poison. Ruth stood for a long moment, her knuckles white on the rope of the bucket, her gaze fixed on his retreating back. She did not tremble, she did not weep. Her face was a mask of calm. But inside, a cold resolve was beginning to crystallize. Later, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, she comforted a frightened Jacob. He had seen the encounter at the well from a distance, and the fear he felt for his sister was a palpable thing. She held him close, stroking his hair, her own fear carefully hidden away. In a moment of quiet introspection, her hand went to her neck, her fingers closing around a small, smooth wooden bird that hung from a leather cord. It was worn smooth with time and touch, its simple shape a familiar comfort against her skin. The bird was a gift from her father, a man brought from Africa, a man whose face was now a fading memory, but whose stories were etched into her soul. He had been sold away when she was barely a girl, but not before he had given her the forbidden tales of the old ways, of spirits that walked in the twilight, and gateways that existed between worlds, hidden in plain sight. He told her their true names were not for the masters, that a name held power, and that a soul, her soul, could never be truly owned. Clutching the bird, she could almost hear his voice, a deep and resonant whisper from a life she barely remembered, a promise of a reality beyond the one she was forced to endure. The tipping point came that evening. The air had cooled slightly, but the night was still thick with the chorus of crickets and the distant baying of hounds. Ruth sat on the porch of her cabin, mending a tear in Jacob's shirt, the rhythmic pull of the needle, a small, steadying motion in a world spinning out of control. It was then that she overheard the voices from the path, lazy and slurred with drink. It was Elias, talking to Finch, the overseer. Elias was drunker now, his anger from the afternoon stoked into a petulant fire by the evening's liquor. "I'm done waiting, Finch," he declared, his voice loud and careless. "That girl, Ruth, she thinks she's too good. I'll show her. Tomorrow night, she's moving into the house. My house. See to it." Finch, a man whose obedience was as ingrained as the lines on his face, simply nodded. His response was a low, gravelly grunt of assent. "Yes, Master Elias." The words were simple, an order given and an order accepted, but for Ruth, they were a death sentence. The finality in Elias's voice, the casual cruelty of the command, extinguished the last flickering ember of hope she had harbored for a life of quiet endurance. Her hands stilled, the needle frozen in the rough fabric. Her face, illuminated by the faint moonlight, became a stoic mask, her expression unreadable. The decision, which had been a form of abstract thought, a desperate prayer, now solidified into a concrete, unshakable plan. Her gaze drifted from the darkened fields, past the other cabins, and settled on the squat, dark silhouette of the smokehouse at the edge of the woods. It was a place of curing and preservation, a place of fire and smoke, a place of transformation. We see her moving through the twilight, a phantom in the gathering dark. Her actions were no longer those of a slave going about her evening chores. They were precise, deliberate, and filled with a hidden purpose. She slipped to the edge of the woods, her eyes scanning the undergrowth. She gathered specific herbs, ones the old woman, Hattie, used for poultices and remedies. But Ruth knew they had other uses whispered in her father's tales. She found the sharp, clean scent of pine needles, the silvery leaves of mugwort, and the dark, clustered berries of a plant the others avoided. Her movements were swift and silent. From a hidden nook in her cabin, she secured a tinderbox, its metal cool and solid in her hand. Her final action was to go to Jacob. He was already asleep on their thin pallet, his breathing soft and even, his face peaceful in the gloom. She knelt beside him, her heart a painful, aching knot in her chest. A single tear, hot and silent, traced a path through the grime on her cheek as she leaned down and kissed his forehead. The touch was as light as a moth's wing. "Be strong, little bird," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she could not afford to show. "Remember the stories." The oppressive atmosphere of the night was thick with the buzz of cicadas and the weight of unspoken fear. Ruth's internal monologue was a silent, racing current, not of plans of escape, not of finding a path north through the swamps and forests. She was not running from Elias. She was erasing herself from his world entirely. The fear was a cold, hard thing in her stomach, a primal terror of the unknown, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, unwavering resolve, a determination as solid and real as the scorched earth she would soon leave behind. She was choosing her own fate, not as a runaway, but as a soul reclaiming its freedom in the only way she had left. The final walk began just before dusk, in that liminal moment when the world holds its breath between the searing heat of day and the suffocating dark of night. The last time anyone saw Ruth Ellis, she was walking from the communal woodpile towards the smokehouse, her arms loaded with a precarious stack of split oak and hickory. Her expression was what unsettled the few who witnessed her passage. It was not the face of a woman heading for punishment, nor one resigned to a grim fate. It was serene, almost blank, a placid lake over an unfathomable depth. Her eyes seemed to look past the red clay, past the wilting crops, past the very horizon of the world she knew. Jacob watched her from the doorway of their cabin, a knot of pure, childish dread tightening in his small chest. The piece of charcoal she had used for his lesson lay forgotten in the dirt by his feet. He wanted to call out to her, to shout her name, to run and cling to her legs and beg her not to go where she was going. but the words froze in his throat, caught by the look on her face. It was a look of such profound and unshakable finality that it felt like a physical barrier between them. It was the look of a door closing quietly, but forever. He saw her as a figure moving through a dream, already distant, already belonging to the place of shadows she was walking towards. Her thoughts were a low, steady hum beneath the surface of her calm, a chant of names and places she had never seen but knew intimately from her father's whispered stories. She was no longer Ruth Ellis, a name given to her by the people who owned her body. In the quiet sanctuary of her mind, she was reclaiming a name she had kept buried in her heart, a name that tasted of salt and wind and freedom, a name that connected her to a long line of people who had never known a master's whip. With each step towards the dark, squat building, the identity of the slave sloughed away, and the true woman, the one with the ancient name, walked forward to meet her destiny. Inside the smokehouse, the air was a physical presence. It was thick with the lingering, ghostly perfume of cured hams and years of hickory smoke that had worked its way into the very grain of the wooden walls. A sliver of dying light filtered through the cracks between the boards, illuminating swirling dust motes in the gloom. Ruth let the firewood fall to the dirt floor with a dull, scattered thud. Her first action was one of absolute commitment. She turned to the heavy oak door and slid the massive wooden bar across its brackets. The sound of the wood scraping into place was deafening in the silence, a resonant boom that echoed with the finality of a coffin being sealed. She was locked in by her own hand. She did not build a fire for warmth or for cooking, the kind of fire that belonged to the world outside. Instead, she began her work with the meticulous care of a priestess preparing a sacred space. She arranged the pieces of wood on the floor, not in a pile, but in a perfect, intricate spiral, starting from the very center of the small room and working her way out. Each piece laid with intention, the pattern grew, a wooden galaxy on the earthen floor. From the small, rough-spun pouch she had carried, she took the herbs she had gathered. She crumbled the dried leaves between her fingers, releasing their potent scents into the already thick atmosphere. The clean, sharp fragrance of pine, the silvery, mystical aroma of mugwort, and something else, something acrid and strange that smelled of deep earth and lightning, filled the small space. She sprinkled the fragrant dust over the spiraling wood, an offering to the forces she was about to summon. Finally, her preparations complete, she moved to the center of the spiral. She sat, her legs crossed, her back straight, a figure of impossible poise in the heart of the smoky dark. She took the small wooden bird from the leather cord around her neck and placed it on the ground before her, its simple shape a silent witness. Closing her eyes, she drew in a long, slow breath, and the chant began. The words that left her lips were low and guttural, a language that no one on the Wallace plantation would have understood. It was the language of her ancestors, a river of sound that had flowed through generations, waiting for this moment. The words were about passage, about shedding one's skin like a snake, about walking between the worlds of the seen and the unseen. Night fell completely, draping the plantation in a blanket of oppressive darkness. Elias, his arrogance fueled by another several glasses of whiskey, came looking for the woman who had dared to defy him. He stumbled through the darkness, his path weaving and uncertain, his mind fixated on the punishment he would exact. He saw the smokehouse, a block of deeper black against the night, and that it was dark and silent. A fresh wave of rage washed over him. He pounded a fist on the heavy door, the sound a dull, fleshy thud. "Ruth, I know you're in there," he shouted, his voice a furious slur that dripped with venom and entitlement. "Open this door. Don't make me break it down, girl." There was no answer, only the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind. His pounding grew more frantic, more violent. The actions of a spoiled child denied his prize. The noise drew Finch, who appeared out of the darkness like a grim specter, his face set in its usual mask of weary disapproval. "Master Elias, leave it be," the overseer said, his voice a low rumble. "She's locked herself in. She can't go nowhere. We'll deal with her in the morning when she's hungry and cold and had time to think on her foolishness." Elias spat a string of curses into the night, his rage turning from Ruth to the man who was counseling patience. But the overseer's logic, coupled with his own drunkenness, eventually penetrated his fury. After aiming one last violent kick at the unyielding door, a kick that sent a jarring pain up his leg, he relented. "Fine," he snarled. "But in the morning, Finch, in the morning, she's mine." He stumbled back toward the distant lights of the main house, his threats swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. Inside, the world of Elias and Finch had ceased to exist for Ruth. With the tinderbox, she struck a spark. The flames caught the herb, dusted wood with an unnatural quickness. But this was no ordinary fire. The smoke did not rise in a straight, orderly column toward the smoke-blackened chimney hole in the roof. It coiled and writhed, moving with a serpentine grace, hugging the ground before spiraling inward toward her. It shimmered with a strange silvery luminescence, each particle of soot seeming to hold a tiny spark of light. The smoke clung to her, enveloping her in its ghostly embrace, but she did not cough or choke. It filled her lungs not with acrid fumes, but with a clean, electric energy. The air smelled of burning pine, of sacred herbs, and of the sharp metallic tang of a coming storm, the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. Her chant grew stronger, the ancient words flowing from her in a steady, rhythmic torrent. Her body began to sway with the cadence, a gentle, hypnotic motion that matched the dance of the shimmering smoke. The world outside the smokehouse, the sounds of Elias's impotent rage and Finch's grim practicality, the entire reality of the Wallace plantation, faded into an irrelevant, distant hum. There was only the fire, the smoke, and the sound of her own voice calling across the veil. Ruth's fear, the cold knot that had lived in her stomach for years, had completely sublimated, burned away by the strange fire she had created. In its place was a state of ecstatic focus, a clarity so profound it was almost painful. She felt a powerful, undeniable connection to her father. His stories no longer just memories, but a living map unfolding before her. She felt the presence of his ancestors and hers, a great cloud of witnesses standing just beyond the veil of smoke, their strength pouring into her. The smoke was not suffocating her, it was unmaking her. She could feel it dissolving the physical reality of her bondage, loosening the bonds of flesh and bone that had tied her to this life of pain. Her introspection was no longer one of sorrow or desperation, but of glorious release. She was shedding a lifetime of oppression, of humiliation, of back-breaking labor, of constant gnawing fear, casting it off like a heavy, filthy cloak she had been forced to wear for far too long. The camera of the mind focuses on her face, her eyes closed, her expression one of serene transport as the shimmering silver smoke completely envelops her. The rhythmic chant that had filled the small room softened, the words melting away until only a single, sustained, resonant note remained. It was a sound that seemed to be the root of all music, a vibration that harmonized with the very fabric of the universe. For one brilliant, impossible moment, the fire in the center of the spiral flared, casting the interior of the smokehouse in a silent, blinding flash of pure white light. Then, in an instant, it was gone. The fire, the light, the sound, all of it vanished, plunging the room into a darkness more absolute than night, and a silence more profound than death. The scene shifts. The oppressive black has given way to the soft gray light of early morning. Dew clings to every blade of grass, sparkling like a million tiny diamonds. Hattie, the old woman whose eyes had seen too much to be surprised by anything, was the first to stir. Her bones ached, but her routine was as fixed as the rising of the sun. As she stepped out of her cabin, her gaze was immediately drawn to the smokehouse. It stood silent and still against the dawn sky. The chimney was cold. There was no wisp of smoke, no sign of life. A deep, instinctual fear, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the morning chill, gripped her. She walked slowly toward it, her bare feet making no sound on the damp earth. She reached the door and put her hand on the rough wood. She pushed. It didn't move. She tried the latch, her gnarled fingers fumbling with the mechanism. It was useless. The door was barred from the inside. Hattie stepped back, her face a mask of awe and terror. She knew. She didn't know how, but she knew what this meant. A lifetime of listening to whispers, of remembering the old ways, of seeing the unseen, had prepared her for this moment. She turned away from the impossible door, her movements suddenly urgent. She hurried toward the overseer's cabin, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her voice trembling as she prepared to raise the alarm that would shatter the morning's peace. Hattie's alarm was not a scream, but a low, urgent call that cut through the morning mist with more force than any shriek. It roused Finch from a shallow, restless sleep. He emerged from his cabin, his annoyance plain on his face, thinking only that Ruth had finally given up her foolish stunt, her stomach rumbling and her spirit broken by a night in the dark. He grabbed a heavy iron mallet that leaned against his wall, its handle worn smooth from use, its head designed for breaking things that refused to yield. As he strode towards the smokehouse, a small crowd of the enslaved began to gather at a distance, their faces a mixture of deep, ingrained fear and a morbid, electric curiosity. They were drawn to the unfolding drama like moths to a flame, knowing that any disruption to the plantation's brutal order could end in tragedy, yet unable to look away. Jacob was at the very front of the silent assembly, a small, trembling figure wrapped in the morning chill, his eyes fixed on the dark, silent building that had swallowed his sister. Just then, Elias emerged from the main house, his face puffy and blotched with the anger of the previous night, his fine clothes rumpled. The sight of the still, barred door reignited his fury. "Get that door open, Finch." "Cool," he commanded, his voice raw and grating. "I'll teach her a lesson about defiance she won't ever forget." Finch hefted the mallet, the weight of it familiar and reassuring in his hands. He was a man who solved problems with force, and this was a problem he understood. He swung the heavy tool, the muscles in his back and shoulders coiling and releasing. The first blow struck the heavy oak door with a deafening crack that made the gathered crowd flinch as one. The door shuddered in its frame, but the bar held fast. The second swing was harder, fueled by a growing irritation. It landed just beside the iron lock, and the wood around it splintered, white wounds appearing on the dark, weathered surface. For the third swing, Finch put all his strength into it. The mallet struck with the force of a thunderclap, and the thick wooden crossbar on the inside shattered with a sharp, final snap. The door groaned open a few inches, swinging inward into the gloom. A wave of cold, stale air washed over them. An exhalation from a tomb. It smelled of old ash, damp earth, and that same strange electric tang from the night before, the scent of a storm that had passed. Finch, his breath misting in the chill, stepped inside, his eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. He took 2 steps and then stopped dead, the mallet hanging forgotten in his hand. The room was empty. His gaze swept across the small space, taking in the pile of cold gray ashes in the central fire pit, the neatly arranged but entirely unburnt wood at the outer edges of the spiral. His eyes fell to the floor. He saw the footprints. "What in God's name?" he muttered, the words a puff of white vapor in the cold air. Elias, his patience gone, pushed roughly past him, his rage turning instantly to a sputtering confusion. "Where is she?" he demanded, his eyes darting wildly around the empty space. "Is she hiding in the rafters? Did she climb up the chimney?" He looked up into the dark soot, blackened flue, as if expecting to see her peering down at him. Their disbelief warred with the impossible evidence before them. Finch knelt, his rough fingers tracing the air just above one of the footprints in the dirt. They were clearly Ruth's, the size and shape familiar to him from 100 muddy paths and dusty fields. He and Elias began to trace the pattern, their boots scuffing the edges of the outer rings. They followed the perfect spiral as it coiled inward toward the cold ashes, and they saw it, the detail that made the hair on their arms stand on end. The footprints became progressively shallower, less defined with each rotation. The first few prints were deep and clear, the mark of a woman's full weight, but as they circled closer to the center, they seemed to fade, as if the person making them was growing lighter, becoming less substantial. Her connection to the earth dissolving with every step. The trail ended abruptly, not with a scuff or a leap, but with a final, faint impression that was barely a whisper in the dirt. It stopped at the edge of a small, circular patch of earth, perhaps 2 feet in diameter. The ground here was different. It was black, hard, and cracked like old pottery, as if it had been struck by a bolt of lightning from a cloudless sky. It was utterly barren. There were no tracks leading away from it, no sign of a struggle, no indication that the door had been opened and closed. The footprints simply stopped, as if the woman who made them had been lifted straight up into the heavens, or had descended into the earth itself. The commotion had drawn the plantation owner, a portly, severe man named Alistair Wallace, from his breakfast. He arrived, his face a mask of cold fury, his presence casting a pall over the already tense scene. He did not see a mystery. He saw conspiracy, an affront to his absolute authority. "This is a trick," he boomed, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. "She had help. Someone dug a tunnel. This is a mockery of my household." He jabbed a finger at the floor. "Finch, get some men. I want this entire smokehouse floor dug up. We will find how she did this." Several men were summoned, and they spent the morning in the grim, claustrophobic space, their shovels biting into the packed earth. They dug with a grim determination, their sweat mingling with the cold, strange air. They found nothing. There was no tunnel. There were no hidden chambers. They found only the dense, packed clay of Virginia, tangled with roots and stones. The ground beneath the scorched patch was no different from the rest. As the pile of excavated dirt grew outside the smokehouse door, the impossibility of the situation began to dawn on everyone. A slow, creeping dread that was far more unsettling than any simple escape. During the height of the commotion, as Alistair Wallace bellowed orders and the shovels scraped against the hard earth, Jacob slipped away from the crowd. His small body moved with a stealth born of a lifetime of avoiding notice. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, but a strange, new purpose guided his feet. He circled the smokehouse, keeping to the tall grass, his eyes scanning the ground. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that there had to be something, a sign, a message left just for him. And then he saw it. Near the back wall, half hidden in the damp grass where the morning dew still clung, was a small, dark shape. He crept closer. It was the wooden bird, dropped from its leather cord, lying on its side as if it were sleeping. He snatched it up, his small hand closing around the smooth, familiar wood. It felt warm, not just with the residual heat of the morning sun, but with a deep, pulsing warmth, as if it held a tiny, beating heart within it. A wave of understanding, profound and wordless, washed over him. This was not an accident. This was a message. This was a secret he must keep locked away in his own heart. Alistair Wallace, his face growing redder with every denial, began interrogating the enslaved people one by one. He threatened them with the lash, with the selling block, with every horror he could conjure, but their faces remained blank masks of ignorance. They all denied any knowledge of Ruth's plan, their eyes wide with a convincing, and in most cases genuine, fear and confusion. When he finally came to Hattie, she did not flinch from his furious gaze. She stood before him, her small, frail body possessing an unshakable dignity. She looked him directly in the eye, and her own gaze held no fear, only a deep, ancient wisdom that he could not comprehend. "Some folks ain't meant to be caged, Master Wallace," she said, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. "Some souls know the way back home." Her cryptic words infuriated him. It felt like mockery, a confirmation of the conspiracy he could not prove. He dismissed her with a curse, but he could get nothing more from her. Later that day, Hattie found Jacob crying silently behind one of the cabins, his small body racked with sobs he was trying to suppress. He clutched the wooden bird so tightly his knuckles were white. She placed a gentle, wrinkled hand on his shoulder. "Don't you cry for her, child," she whispered, her voice a soft, comforting balm. "Your sister ain't gone. She just crossed over. She's free now, in a way they can't ever touch." As the day wore on, the atmosphere on the Wallace plantation underwent a strange and profound transformation. The initial anger and fury of the white inhabitants began to curdle into a creeping, superstitious dread. They were people of a rigid, ordered world, and the inexplicable events in the smokehouse had shattered that order. The mystery of the cold fire, the door barred from the inside, and the footprints that led to nowhere became the central, unexplainable fact of their lives. For the enslaved, however, the feeling was entirely different. It was a terrifying, exhilarating miracle. In the fields, they stole glances at one another, a new light in their eyes. They saw the bafflement and fear on their masters' faces, the way Finch kept staring at his own hands as if they had failed him, the way Elias started at shadows, the way Alistair Wallace paced his veranda, his authority suddenly fragile. And in their master's fear, they tasted a small, intoxicating sip of power. The smokehouse was no longer just a building for curing meat. It had become a monument, a question mark carved into the heart of the plantation, a symbol of a power that their oppressors could not understand, and therefore could not control. The rigid order of the plantation had been broken, not by a rebellion of muscle and steel, but by a quiet act of impossible defiance. The days that followed the impossible discovery were a blur of organized chaos and simmering hysteria. Master Wallace, a man who believed the world operated on the principles of ownership, labor, and punishment, refused to accept the impossible. He saw Ruth's disappearance not as a mystery but as an insurrection of one, a profound and personal insult to his authority. He organized a massive search party, pulling men from the fields and enlisting neighbors who were intrigued by the bizarre story and eager for a distraction. Men on horseback, their faces grim, fanned out across the rolling Virginia landscape, their leather saddles creaking in a rhythmic chorus of futility. They scoured the dense, humid woods for miles in every direction, their calls echoing through the trees. Ruth. Ruth Ellis, the name, which had once been a summons, now became a question thrown into an indifferent wilderness. They combed the muddy banks of the nearby river, searching for a body or a sign of a crossing. They sent word to neighboring plantations, describing the runaway, though the description always ended with a confused and abbreviated account of the circumstances, which only served to deepen the myth. The dogs, usually the most feared and relentless tool in the arsenal of the slave catcher, were strangely useless. Finch brought the best trackers, lean hounds with mournful eyes and noses that could follow a day-old trail through a swamp. But near the smokehouse, they became confused, agitated things. They whined, their tails tucked low between their legs, and refused to pick up a scent. They would circle the small, dark building, their noses to the ground, sniffing at the air with a palpable sense of distress before backing away, their hackles raised. It was as if the very ground around the smokehouse was a void, a place where the past had been erased. Finch watched them, a cold knot of unease tightening in his gut. He had seen dogs track men through hellacious conditions, but he had never seen them react with such primal fear. The search turned up nothing, not a single footprint in the soft earth beyond the immediate vicinity of the quarters, not a torn piece of cloth snagged on a briar, not a single solitary trace of Ruth Ellis beyond the door she had barred herself. Days later, Finch stood before Alistair Wallace on the veranda of the main house, his hat in his hands, his face a grim mask of failure. "It's no use, sir," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "We've searched every inch of this county and the next. There's no trail. It's not natural. It's like she just evaporated." Wallace, his face the color of a ripe plum, his jowls trembling with rage, did not want to hear about things that were not natural. He wanted results. He wanted his property returned. He wanted the order of his world restored. He hurled the crystal glass of whiskey he was holding against the whitewashed wall of the house, where it shattered with a sound like a gunshot. The amber liquid ran down the wall like tears. "Find her," he roared, spittle flying from his lips. "I don't care how. Or by God, I'll find an overseer who can." But both men knew the threat was hollow. No overseer could find a ghost, while the masters searched the physical world. The story of Ruth's vanishing spread through a different, more powerful network. It traveled on the lips of the enslaved, a current of whispered awe that moved faster than any horse. It was passed from one to another during secret meetings in the deep of night, in the brief moments of shared labor in the fields, and through the coded, sorrowful lyrics of the songs they sang as they toiled under the sun. The story became a powerful piece of oral tradition, a modern myth born in the crucible of their suffering. The details were repeated with a sacred reverence, each telling reinforcing the miracle. The door, barred from within, the fire, cold as a grave, the footprints, spiraling into nothingness. In the telling, the story grew, embellished not with lies, but with the poetry of a people desperate for magic. Some said the smoke that rose from the chimney that night was not smoke at all, but a great silver bird, an eagle or a hawk, that had swooped down, wrapped Ruth in its wings, and carried her away into the stars. Others whispered that the ground itself, the very earth of Virginia that had held them in bondage for so long, had recognized one of its own, had opened up and offered her a secret path to freedom, a tunnel not of dirt but of spirit. The phrase, "She didn't run, she vanished," became a powerful mantra of hope, a declaration that there were forms of escape beyond the reach of dogs and men, a freedom of the soul that could not be chained. The psychological impact of the event settled over the plantation like a permanent, low, hanging fog, affecting everyone, but none more so than Elias. The vanishing shattered his fragile sense of dominance, the core of his identity. He was haunted by the last image he had of Ruth, her serene, almost blank expression, as she walked to the smokehouse. It was a look he now understood not as submission, but as a terrifying, unknowable power. His world, once a simple hierarchy with him near the top, had become a place of shadows and secrets. He grew paranoid, seeing defiance and conspiracy in every averted gaze, in every whispered conversation. He was convinced they were all laughing at him, that they all knew the secret of how she had done it, and were mocking his impotence. His cruelty, once casual and entitled, became vicious and unpredictable. He whipped a man for looking at him the wrong way, his rage a wild, flailing thing. He spent his nights drinking heavily, the whiskey no longer a pleasant diversion but a desperate medicine to quiet the screaming in his own mind. Often, in the dead of night, he would wander out of the main house, a bottle dangling from his hand, and just stare at the silent, dark smokehouse, a monument to his humiliation. It stood there, squat and unmoving, holding its secret, mocking him with its very existence. Finch, a man of logic and brute force, a man who believed only in what he could see and touch and break, was also deeply unnerved. The scene in the smokehouse played over and over in his mind, a puzzle with no solution. He could not reconcile the physical facts, the bar on the door, the cold ashes, the footprints that ended. It violated the fundamental laws of the world as he understood them. In the days and weeks that followed, he found himself secretly returning to the smokehouse, usually at dusk or dawn when he was unlikely to be seen. He would run his calloused hands over the scorched patch of earth, feeling its strange, hard texture, digging at it with his fingernails, searching for a hidden spring, a loose stone, and any rational explanation. He found nothing. The lack of an answer, the sheer, stubborn impossibility of it all, began to eat away at the foundations of his certainty. It planted a seed of doubt, not just about Ruth, but about the very nature of the world he thought he knew. A world of masters and slaves, of whips and chains, a world he had never before had reason to question. For Jacob, the event was a painful, sacred transformation. He treasured the small wooden bird, keeping it hidden in a small cloth pouch he wore tied to his waist. It was his only tangible link to his sister, a focal point for his grief and his burgeoning understanding. He listened with a new, desperate intensity as Hattie, seeing the weight of the secret on his young shoulders, began to tell him more of the old stories, the ones his father had told her, the ones that had been passed down through the long, dark night of their people's captivity. He learned about the power of true names, the ones given by the Spirit, not the Master. He learned of intention, of how a focused will could bend the world in small, unseen ways. He learned of the world that lay just beyond the veil of the senses, a world of spirits and ancestors who had not forgotten them. The memory of his sister, a sharp, painful loss, slowly began to transform into a sacred duty. He became the quiet keeper of the true story. He understood, with a wisdom far beyond his years, that the legend of the silver bird and the opening earth was for everyone, a shield and a song for the community. But the truth of her quiet, unbending resolve, the story of a woman who chose to unmake herself rather than be broken, that was his alone to protect. He held the secret in his heart, a single hot coal that both warmed him and burned him with its terrible, beautiful light. This was the birth of the legend. The story of Ruth Ellis became a form of spiritual resistance, a narrative of power that could be wielded in a place where all other power had been stripped away. It gave the enslaved community a hero who was not a warrior, a miracle that was not in a holy book, and a sense of agency that their masters could not touch, could not whip, and could not sell. The fear and confusion that now plagued the white inhabitants of the Wallace plantation was a stark, satisfying contrast to the growing sense of wonder and empowerment that flickered in the slave quarters. The smokehouse was no longer just a building. It was a symbol. It was a place of power. It was a promise, whispered in the dark, that the walls of their prison were not as solid as they appeared. Years passed, flowing like the slow, muddy river that bordered the plantation, each one carving the landscape of their lives a little deeper. The narrative jumps forward, landing in the late 1850s, a time when the very air in Virginia seemed to crackle with the tension of a coming storm. The whispers of war were growing louder, a distant drumming that was felt more than heard. On the Wallace plantation, the decay was no longer just a moral stain. It was a physical reality. Master Alistair Wallace had died years ago, his cold fury finally silenced by a sudden affliction of the heart, leaving his ruinous legacy to his son. Elias, now a man in his late 30s, ran the plantation, or rather, ran it into the ground. He was a man hollowed out by drink and haunted by a ghost he could never catch. The plantation's fields produced less each year. The fences sagged, and the paint on the main house peeled like sunburnt skin. Elias's cruelty, however, had not diminished. It had only grown more desperate and erratic as his debts mounted, and the smokehouse, the epicenter of the legend, still stood. It was abandoned now, weathered to a silvery gray, its rooflines sagging and its walls choked with a thick blanket of ivy. It had become an object of potent superstition for everyone, black and white alike. The white children were told it was haunted by the ghost of a runaway, a story meant to keep them away from its crumbling structure. For the enslaved community, it was treated as a sacred, silent monument. No one went near it without a reason, but it was never truly ignored. Sometimes, a small, subtle offering would appear near its door, a uniquely shaped river stone, a wildflower plucked from the edge of the woods, a small feather, left not in worship, but in remembrance. It was a place of power, a place that held a question that had never been answered. Jacob was no longer a frightened boy clutching a secret. He was a man in his early 20s, tall and strong, with a quiet, steady wisdom in his eyes that reminded the older folks of his sister Ruth. The years had molded him. Hattie's teachings had shaped him, and his sister's memory had forged him. He had become a leader, not through overt rebellion or fiery speeches, but through his ability to organize, to listen, and to instill a sense of hope where there was none. He moved with a quiet confidence that was not arrogance, but the deep-rooted strength of a man who knew his own worth, a knowledge that had been his sister's final, most precious gift. He carried the small wooden bird with him always, no longer on a cord around his neck, but tucked safely in a small pouch at his belt. The wood was now dark and polished to a soft sheen from years of constant, thoughtful handling. He had taken Hattie's lessons to heart, understanding that the legend of his sister was a tool, a weapon of the spirit that could be used in the war they were all fighting. One evening, in a secret meeting behind the cabins, shielded from the main house by a stand of tall pines, Jacob met with a few other trusted men. The air was thick with despair. Elias, in a drunken rage over a perceived slight, had sold a man's wife to a trader passing through, the separation as sudden and brutal as a lightning strike. The community was reeling. One of the men, a strong field hand named Moses, whose face was etched with weary anger, spat on the ground. "There's no escaping him," he said, his voice a low, defeated growl. "He is the devil himself. He will pick us off one by one until there is nothing left." The other men murmured in agreement, their shoulders slumped. Jacob waited for them to finish, his gaze steady. He reached into his pouch and his fingers closed around the familiar, smooth shape of the bird. "Ruth escaped," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the despair. The men fell silent, looking at him. "She showed us," Jacob continued, his voice gaining strength. "The walls of this place, the whips, the chains, they are not as strong as they look. She found a door where there was none." He wasn't speaking of magic, and they knew it. He was speaking of will, of a refusal to be broken that was so powerful it had bent reality itself. The new, imminent threat arrived on a humid afternoon, in the form of a man with cold, dead eyes, and a suit that was too fine for the dusty roads he traveled. He was a slave trader, a purveyor of human misery, and he met with Elias on the veranda of the main house. The community watched from a distance, a cold dread settling over them. They could hear the murmur of their voices, the clinking of glasses as Elias poured the man whiskey. Elias, desperate to pay off the gambling debts that threatened to consume him entirely, was making a deal. The trader specialized in acquiring labor for the notorious cotton plantations of the Deep South, places from which no one, not a single soul, was ever heard from again. It was a death sentence, a descent into a hell even worse than the one they currently endured. The news spread through the quarters not like a fire, but like a frost, chilling every heart. The trader had purchased a lot of 10 people. The list of names was a litany of despair. Moses and his eldest son, a young couple who had only just been married, an old woman valued for her knowledge of herbs, and 4 other strong field hands. The final names on the list were Jacob, his wife Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter Rose. That night, Jacob stood before the abandoned smokehouse. The moon was a thin, silver crescent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. The air was still and heavy, thick with the scent of night, blooming jasmine and the faint, ever-present smell of wood smoke from the quarters. He was not praying for a miracle. He was not asking his sister's spirit to open the earth for him. He was drawing strength from her memory, from the sheer, unadulterated power of her will. He stood on the ground where she had last stood, and he finally, completely, understood. Ruth's act wasn't about magic, not in the way the stories told it. It was about choice. It was about looking at an impossible situation, a world designed to crush her, and refusing to accept the terms. She had chosen to erase herself from their world rather than submit to it. Her defiance was absolute. He, Jacob, would not be sold. He would not let his wife be brutalized and his daughter be born into the living hell of a Mississippi cotton plantation. He would honor his sister's legacy, not by vanishing into myth, but by running into the uncertain promise of freedom. He would take her spiritual victory and translate it into a physical one, the legend of the haunted smokehouse. The very thing that had made it a place of fear and avoidance now provided the perfect cover. The next night, Jacob gathered the other 9 who were to be sold. They met not behind the cabins, but inside the smokehouse itself. They had to force the ivy, choked door, its wood swollen and soft with rot. Inside, it was a tomb of dust and silence. The air was thick with the smell of decay and dry rot. But underneath it all, Jacob could still smell it, the faint, lingering scent of pine, herbs, and ozone. Moonlight streamed through the holes in the roof, illuminating a space filled with cobwebs as thick as cotton and the debris of 2 decades of neglect. But the spiral of footprints was gone, long since erased by time, weather, and the digging that Wallace had ordered. Only the small, circular patch of scorched earth remained in the center of the floor, a dark, barren scar that no weed or blade of grass had ever dared to cross. They stood around it, a small, desperate circle of people, their faces pale and grim in the moonlight. "Here," Jacob said, his voice a low whisper that was swallowed by the oppressive silence. "This is where we will plan. This is where we will hide what we need. They fear this place. They will not follow us here." They used the fear that had been a weapon against them and turned it into a shield. Over the next week, they began to secretly gather supplies, a little extra food, a handful of cornmeal, a piece of dried meat, stolen from the kitchens and smokehouses, a worn blanket, a small cookpot, a sharp knife. Each item was smuggled, one by one, into the dusty, silent interior of the old smokehouse, hidden beneath piles of rotted wood and decaying leaves. The tone on the plantation shifted from one of sullen despair to one of taut, urgent, secret action. The legacy of Ruth was no longer just a comforting story whispered by the fire. It was a direct catalyst for a new, audacious act of rebellion. The weight of responsibility on Jacob was immense. He was not just saving himself, his wife, and his child. He was carrying the torch of his sister's defiance, fanning its embers back into a flame. He was the keeper of her story, and now he had to write its next chapter. The tension was a high, thin wire stretched to its breaking point. The date of the sale, the day the trader would return to collect his property, approached with the inexorable dread of a coming execution. It was a race against time, a desperate gamble planned in the heart of a legend, a flight to freedom beginning in the very place where his sister had found her own. The night chosen for the escape was a gift from a vengeful god, a moonless, stormy canvas perfect for vanishing. The wind, a wild and furious thing, howled through the pines, tearing at the roofs of the cabins and whipping the rain into horizontal sheets that stung the skin like thrown gravel. It was a night that drove sensible people indoors, a night for huddling close to the fire, not for venturing out into the roaring darkness. This was the cover Jacob had prayed for. His plan, pieced together from the fragmented whispers of the Underground Railroad, from the hard-won knowledge of runaways who had been caught and returned, and from his own intimate study of the terrain, was meticulous. The storm was the final, unpredictable element, a protective blanket of chaos. The group of 10 gathered in the suffocating darkness behind the abandoned smokehouse, their bodies pressed close together for warmth and courage. They were shadows among shadows, their faces grim masks of determination, illuminated only by the brief, brilliant flashes of lightning that tore across the sky. Jacob held his daughter Rose tight against his chest, her small body wrapped in a thick blanket, her face buried in his shoulder to muffle any sound. His wife, Sarah, stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm, her knuckles white. Her fear was a palpable thing, but beneath it was a core of steel that matched his own. Moses was there, his face a thundercloud of resolve, his large hands clenched into fists. The young couple huddled together, their eyes wide with terror and hope. Each person was a universe of fear, but together they formed a small constellation of defiance. The sound of the wind was a deafening roar, the rain drumming on the smokehouse roof a frantic heartbeat. The darkness was almost absolute, a terrifying and welcome cloak. Jacob gave the signal, a low whistle that was nearly swallowed by the storm. It was time. They were about to move out, to melt into the woods and begin the long, perilous journey north. When the world erupted in light, torches, dozens of them, flared to life around them, their oily flames sputtering and dancing wildly in the wind and rain. They were surrounded. Elias, Finch, and a half-dozen other men stepped out of the darkness, their faces slick with rain and illuminated by the flickering, hellish light. They formed a tight, menacing circle, cutting off all avenues of escape. Behind them, cowering near Elias, stood a young field hand named Samuel, his face a mask of pure terror. He could not meet their eyes. The betrayal was a sudden, cold knife in the gut. Elias, drenched and looking more like a madman than a plantation master, took a staggering step forward. He leveled a heavy pistol, its long barrel aimed directly at Jacob's heart. "Going somewhere, boy?" he sneered, his voice a venomous hiss that barely carried over the wind. He laughed, a crazed, high-pitched sound. "You think you can just disappear? You think you're clever like she was?" His eyes, wild and bloodshot, darted from Jacob to the dark, silent form of the smokehouse. "There's no magic here," he spat, the rain plastering his hair to his skull. "No hocus pocus, no spirits. There's only this." He cocked the pistol, and the sharp metallic click was unnaturally loud, a sound that cut through the roar of the storm and seemed to echo in the sudden ringing silence of their hearts. Jacob did not flinch. He gently pushed Sarah and Rose behind him, shielding them with his own body. He stood tall, not with the arrogance of a man challenging another, but with a profound, unshakable calm that was a perfect, chilling mirror of his sisters all those years ago. The fear was there, a cold serpent coiling in his belly, but it was caged by a will that was older and stronger. He slowly reached into the pouch at his belt and drew out the small, worn wooden bird. He held it up in his open palm, the dark wood gleaming in the torchlight. "This isn't magic, Master Elias," he said, his voice clear and steady, a rock in the torrent of the storm. Elias stared at the bird, his crazed expression faltering for a fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "It's a promise," Jacob continued, his voice rising, filled with a power that came from a place beyond fear. "The promise that you can't own a soul, you can't own a memory, and you can't own our freedom." At that exact moment, as the word freedom left Jacob's lips, a great cry went up from the other side of the plantation. A new light, brighter and more terrible than the torches, bloomed against the dark, stormy sky. Flames, hungry and orange, erupted from the main barn, soaring into the night, devouring the dry wood and hay within. Hattie and the older people, those too frail to make the journey, had created the diversion. They had sacrificed the master's wealth for their people's freedom, a final, defiant act of collective resistance. Every head, including Elias's and his men's, instinctively turned towards the magnificent, terrifying spectacle of the fire. The barn was the heart of the plantation's wealth, and it was being consumed in a roaring inferno. In that split second of distraction, Finch, a man who had been tormented for 2 decades by the impossible memory of a woman who vanished and who was long since disgusted by the pathetic, drunken cruelty of the man he served, made a choice. It was not a grand, heroic gesture. It was a small, almost imperceptible act as Elias, screaming in fury, turned back towards Jacob, his pistol coming up again. Finch, who stood just beside him, gave a slight, clumsy stumble. His shoulder jostled Elias's arm just as his finger tightened on the trigger. The pistol fired with a deafening roar, but the shot went wide, the ball plowing harmlessly into the mud a foot to Jacob's left. "They're getting away," Elias screamed, scrambling to recover his balance and his aim. His face a mask of pure, impotent rage. It was the only chance they needed. It was the only chance they would get. Now! Jacob yelled, and the small group of 10 did not run. They dissolved. They melted into the stormy darkness at the edge of the woods, the howling wind and driving rain swallowing them whole. Finch, recovering his footing, gave a half-hearted chase, shouting into the wind, his steps deliberately slow and clumsy. His shouts were lost in the roar of the fire and the fury of the storm. He had finally, in his own quiet, complicated way, chosen a side. He had not freed them, but he had allowed them to free themselves. The scene transitions, the sounds of the storm and the fire fading, replaced by the quiet crunch of snow and the crisp, clean air of a northern winter. Months have passed. We see Jacob, Sarah, and a bundled-up Rose arriving at a settlement of free black people and abolitionist allies in the north. They are gaunt. They are weary, but they are free. The story they tell is not just of their own harrowing escape through swamp and forest, but of the woman who inspired it, the aunt and sister their children would never know. The legend of Ruth Ellis was now complete, a story with two distinct, powerful parts: the magical vanishing that had broken the master's spirit, and the practical, desperate escape it had fueled, which had broken his chains. Years later, the scene is one of impossible peace. An older Jacob, his hair now streaked with gray, sits in a comfortable chair by a warm, crackling hearth. The room is filled with the soft light of an oil lamp and the quiet sounds of a family at home. His freeborn children, their faces bright and curious, are gathered at his feet. He is telling them the story, as he has done so many times before, his voice filled with a deep, abiding reverence and love. He holds out his hand, and in his palm lies the worn wooden bird, its surface now as dark and smooth as polished stone. Her name was Ruth, he says, his voice a low, gentle rumble like distant summer thunder. She never fired a shot, never raised a sword, but she fought back with a power they could never understand. He looks from the faces of his children to the dancing flames in the fireplace. She vanished from their world, he says softly, so that we could one day walk freely in ours. As he stares into the fire, he imagines he can see his sister's face in the swirling smoke and glowing embers. Her eyes are bright, her expression is serene, and on her lips there is the quiet, knowing smile of a woman who had won. The mystery of her disappearance was never solved by the world she left behind, but its meaning, for those who mattered, was made beautifully, powerfully clear. Her act of defiance was not an ending, it was a seed, planted in a small patch of scorched earth, that had grown into a forest of freedom.